Today on Pilot's Discretion, our guest is air traffic controller and pilot Kevin Plante. He tells us about managing busy airspace, flight planning tips for pilots, and when to say unable. Pilot's Discretion starts right now. Hello, pilots. I'm John Zimmerman, and thanks for listening to Pilot's Discretion from Sporties. Visit sporties.com/podcast for today's show links and access to all 80 episodes of Pilot's Discretion. And remember to leave us a review in your favorite podcast app. Today I'm joined by Kevin Plante, an air traffic controller in the Northeast who has worked tower and TRACON at both FAA and U.S. Air Force facilities. He has been active behind the scenes as well, helping design performance-based navigation procedures, implementing new ATC software, and training new controllers. Kevin is one of those rare dual threats, though, because he's also a commercial pilot with multi-engine and instrument ratings who flies both for fun and as a contract pilot for charter operators. On top of all that, Kevin is also a contributor to Pilot Workshop's IFR Mastery Series, where he shares his wisdom. Kevin, I don't know how you do all of that, but welcome to Pilot's Discretion.
Thanks for having me.
Let's start with some basics. And from a controller's perspective, let's start with IFR versus VFR. We know as pilots the difference and, cloud requirements and weather and approaches, but from your perspective behind the scope, if I'm talking to you with VFR flight following versus flying on an IFR clearance, what changes with your job as a controller?
I think the biggest thing is how hands-on I am as a controller about how I'm going to handle a flight. And now, of course, I work Class Bravo airspace every day. So that obviously adds a little bit of a different level to handling VFR flights. And certainly in Bravo airspace, the way that VFR is handled is a whole lot closer to the way IFR is handled. And that's, of course, why you need less cloud clearance in Bravo airspace. But no, in general, IFRs, we get a lot more hands-on, a lot more tightly controlled the way we handle things. And VFR, ideally, we're just another set of eyes for you, trying to help you out in any way that we can.
So is it fair to say as a pilot, sometimes you hear the ATC say, okay, here's your squawk code and your VFR flight following. You're going to keep an eye on me, but really it's still up to me to make sure I'm doing everything I need to do to be safe, whether that's weather, traffic. I mean, you're hopefully going to give me a shout out if something's imminent, but there are fewer requirements on you as a controller if I'm VFR.
That's exactly right. For VFR, you got to remember that radar services to VFR aircraft, flight following, that's all on a workload permitting basis. And that can change minute to minute, second to second type of a thing. So I'll do everything I can to help you out and be an extra set of eyes. But certainly other things can come up with IFR traffic or reading a clearance or any number of other coordinations or things that have to be done as part of my job as a controller that can sidetrack me from paying close attention to every VFR. And so there could be times where I'm paying less attention to a VFR, and then maybe a minute later, I'm paying a whole lot more attention to a VFR.
Now, if I'm headed out to practice approaches for an instrument rating or just currency, and the weather is good, would you prefer as a controller I file IFR and do it all in the system, or do it VFR and just talk to ATC for traffic advisories if I need that?
I think in general, if the weather cooperates for it, then I think VFR is easier. I certainly would not encourage a pilot to put themselves in a bad spot with cloud clearance and basic VFR weather minimums type of a thing. But in general, it's easier if you're VFR because I don't have to give you as much separation when we're providing the service. And sometimes that allows me to give you more of what it is that you're asking for if I don't have to provide as much separation.
You mentioned you work some busy airspace. So give us a sense of how you handle that, maybe even just from a strategic level. You've got both GA traffic, airline traffic, lots of airline traffic, but even GA breaks down into training aircraft, business jets. So if you have a stream of, Boeings and Airbus inbound for the main airline airport, and then some Piston airplanes for another airport, and then maybe a business jet coming to a third airport, obviously there's sectors with air traffic control, but how do you handle that at a high level? How do you keep that chaos from taking over?
In general, we try to keep things as organized and straightforward as we can. Obviously, weather can throw a wrench into those gears, but in general, we try to keep a standardized flow into the big airline airport, and we keep that as standard as normal as we can. And then any overflights and satellite traffic, we try to work around the normal SOP flows that we have into the big airline airport.
And if I'm VFR flying around a Class B airport, are there any general tips for what I should or should not do? Is it bad manners to fly over the top of the Class B VFR or right under the shelf or right along the edge? What's something that will be maybe legal but annoying to a controller?
Legal but annoying. I would even go a little bit farther to say legal but probably not safe is if you're just 3 inches outside of the Bravo underneath the shelf type of a thing. If you find yourself in that spot where you're looking at, okay, well, my strobe light on that side is not in the Bravo, and you're looking at it in those level of proximities, that can be in a bad spot, because in order to vector arrivals at the busy airport, at the big airline airport, in order to vector them to join the approach from below the glide path, which is what we always want to be doing for a nice stabilized approach. In order to do that, we're often vectoring heavy jets and sometimes super A380s, which throw off an awful lot of wake, very dangerous. We have them at the floor of the Class Bravo. So the distance that you are outside the Class Bravo is oftentimes the distance that you are away from these much larger aircraft that can cause dangerous wake that you might have to deal with.
Yeah, I think that's an underappreciated risk by some pilots, that airplanes right on the bottom of the Class Bravo shelf can be closer than you might think. And you mentioned wake turbulence. This is a topic that doesn't get a lot of attention, I don't think, in initial or recurrent training. It seems to depend on the flight instructor and whether they've ever had a personal experience with it. So if a controller says, let's say I'm landing at big Class Bravo airport, and the controller says caution wake turbulence, 3 miles in trail of a Boeing 767. What does that mean? What should I do? Can I ask for a turn if I'm uncomfortable? What are my options there?
Well, if they say caution wake turbulence, that's just sort of box checking. They're required to say it. That if you're following them and you're in Bravo airspace, then separation is being provided for you, whether you're IFR or VFR. If you're in Bravo and you're following this larger airplane, then wake turbulence separation is provided unless you report them in sight and you're then following them visually, whether that's VFR or on a visual approach. If you're following them visually, now you are responsible for the wake turbulence separation. But if you haven't accepted an instruction to follow or a clearance for a visual approach to follow, then you're going to have wake turbulence separation provided for you. Now, of course, if you're outside Bravo airspace, then you're not landing at that airport, if either of those things are true, then yeah, you need to pay a lot more attention to your proximity, and that may or may not be an issue for you, depending on where you're at relative to them.
And what's your standard spacing there? If I'm in a 182 behind a 737, what are you shooting for? How many miles?
If you're at a 182 behind a 737, I'm looking for 4 miles. If it's a heavy, then I'm looking for 5 miles. If you're flying in the pattern and when the heavy is at the threshold, then I need 6 miles.
So this gets to a point that gets debated sometimes among pilots. When is it time just to say unable? I mean, we all know as pilots, we have, pilot and command authority. It's up to us. We're sitting in the left seat. We can always declare an emergency, even if things really go south. But when do you think is the time more pilots should just say unable, or that's not going to work? Obviously, we want to please ATC, but as both a pilot and a controller, what's an example of a place where pilots should do that more?
Well, I really don't think, and this is something that comes up, I've heard this before, I don't think that it's necessary to declare an emergency to exercise your authority as PIC. And that comes up with weather deviations also. You don't have to declare an emergency to say, I'm deviating around this thunderstorm. Too bad at ATC if you don't like that. This is what I'm doing. That's within your authority as PIC to do that. Now, as far as in proximity to bigger airplanes, well, I really don't have all that much sympathy. Like if you're flying into a big Class B airport and you say, well, geez, I don't want to be following this a 737 or a 767 on final. It's like, well, nobody forced you to fly into this busy airport that's got a whole bunch of big airplanes. You kind of knew that's what you're signing up for when you decided to come here. So I think on some level, you ought to expect to do that. And probably you should arm yourself with the training and insights on how best to deal with that before going to that busy airport. But when it comes down to it, if you find yourself in the moment of you're there in the here and now, and here's an uncomfortable situation, and I just don't think I like it, there's nothing wrong with saying, you know what, I'm gonna go somewhere else. I'm not gonna land here now. I changed my mind. I think I bit off more than I really wanted to chew, and that's okay. You're better off doing that and going to fly another day than putting yourself in an unsafe position. But you could also ask questions of ATC if you have time, like, are you providing me with wake turbulence separation between me and the traffic ahead? So if you're unsure of that, you can just ask that question of who's providing that spacing.
Yeah, sometimes it's okay to just speak plain English, right? I mean, I think some pilots get caught up in the pilot controller glossary and trying to speak in the code, but I've heard this example many times on even airline pilots on a crossing restriction of, hey, I need this intersection at 12,000 feet. And they'll say, boy, I don't think we can do that. We'll do the best we can, or we might be able to hit it at 13,000. And sometimes I feel like that's just an easier way to explain the situation. Just turn off your pilot brain and speak like a human. Does that work for you as controller if we just use plain English once in a while?
Absolutely. And there's plenty of restrictions where if you're anywhere in the ballpark of it, it's perfectly fine. And there's other restrictions where I really need you to be there in order to maintain separation with other traffic. So with the benefit of a heads up of knowing that you might not be able to meet a restriction, okay, well, maybe we can go to plan B right now. Maybe we can make this so it's not a difficult situation. Maybe it's a vector route or a speed adjustment or relief from a speed restriction or any number of different things that you can do to accomplish what is necessary to be accomplished.
Let's talk about negotiating with ATC, favorite topic of pilots.
Oh,
Let's say I'm on an IFR cross country, and of course I'm looking for a shortcut. When is the right time to ask for that? Does it matter if I'm with center or approach? Does it matter how far I am from my departure airport? Does it matter the weather? What tips do you have so that I can get the shortcut I want without annoying ATC?
well, I'm going to kind of speak as a pilot right now more than a controller, and I'll say, make him say no. Why not? I don't think there's anything wrong with asking for a shortcut. I don't think there's anything wrong with trying to negotiate something like that. And if it's you're tight on fuel type of a thing, or you have a really pressing thing that you're trying to do, or you're not going to make the bus departure if you don't get some kind of a shortcut somewhere along the way, you can communicate that to ATC. We're people on the other side of the microphone, and we're trying to do the best we can. And sometimes the best thing for you isn't a shortcut right now. Sometimes it's leaving you on your route. But if we can give a shortcut, then why not?
And what happens with a handoff, either from sector to sector or to a different facility? Say you're transitioning someone from approach up into the en route center. How much information gets passed on there? If I'm deviating right for weather, does that get typed in the computer and the next controller knows that, or do I need to check on and tell them that?
That is totally situational. It really, really depends. It depends on the facilities involved. It depends on what you're doing for deviation. There are situations where center's calling me on every airplane they're giving me saying, hey, this one wants to deviate this way, this one wants to deviate that way. And I'll just tell them, just switch them. I'll just assume that everybody you're giving me is on some type of a deviation. That's okay. And I'll just sort it out and do what I need to do with them when they when they show up on my frequency. But there's certainly other ways that happens, or where it's whether they're going around or you're going away that's different from other people, or there's a lot of different variations that way. Different facilities handle that differently. Different facilities have different equipment to see what you have in the computer for routing.
Let's talk about that equipment a little bit, because I know center versus approach has different equipment, different software, different capabilities. So what's a difference there that might matter to a pilot? What can you do or not do at approach that would be different from a center?
Well, the big one for center controllers is they have access to the routing that you're on in the computer right on their scope. And that's something they can use. They can make changes to that from their scope without having to do anything else or get up and go somewhere else or ask somebody else to do something for them. So center controllers have a lot more readily information available to them about routing and flight plan information. Approach controllers, most of the way that you go through approach airspace is contained in letters of agreement or standard operating procedures. And that is frequently how approach controllers will know where you're going through airspace, is just that's the way that you're supposed to go through. As an approach controller, I can go over to a flight data computer and pull up your flight plan information. But if you're showing up to my airspace in a way that looks normal and routine, probably I'm not going to bother doing that.
And give us a sense for what's going on in the radar room there. How many, you've got controllers, you've got supervisors. What are the different people in that room? What are the different roles that they play?
Well, that depends a lot on the facility and the size of the facility. The larger facilities, you'll have controllers working the scopes or control positions in the tower looking out the window. And you might have somebody or multiple somebodies working a position where they're coordinating or assisting the controllers that are actively working traffic. You could have somebody working a flight data position where they're issuing clearances and updating NOTAMs and that sort of thing. You'll probably have a supervisor who's providing just general guidance and oversights of the operation. But as you get into smaller facilities, a lot of those functions are more easily done by one person. So those different things would be combined down to a single person with wearing multiple hats, doing multiple roles there.
NOTAMs are a source of confusion and I would say frustration for many pilots. There's too many of them at big airports. They're hard to decipher.
Yes.
What do controllers think of NOTAMs? And do you have access to them? How often are you looking at NOTAMs?
Well, that's another thing that I get frustrated by routinely. The way that we update NOTAMs is every morning we print out on paper all of the NOTAMs for all of the airports in our airspace. And then could be a person working flight data, it could be a supervisor, will then input all that information into a computer system that we have that's available at the scopes called the IDS, Information Dissemination System. They'll put that in so it's available at the scope to controllers to be able to look at. And then over the course of the day, if any of those change, then we're supposed to get a phone call about the change, and then we manually input that into the system. So you can imagine as a pilot how much that hurts my brain to know that I can be flying in an airplane and have data link, ADS-B or XM or whatever you prefer, real-time information to weather and NOTAMs in the air, but that's not a thing at a control position at work.
So if I'm going to an airport, it's definitely on me to make sure I've read the NOTAMs, and maybe if there's a really critical one, you'll have it top of mind and mention it to me. But obviously, PIC, it's on me to know that.
Well, that's an interesting thing that you bring up that way, and a lot of controllers, and I hear this all the time. Controllers love to say, especially when you're going into a non-towered airport, advise when you have the weather and NOTAMs. Well,
Yep.
ATC is not allowed to ask you if you have the NOTAMs for obvious reasons. Maybe you checked NOTAMs 6 hours ago before you departed, and you've been in the air, and you've maybe stopped at a couple airports in the interim. And so did I check the NOTAMs then? Is there anything else that's come up in between? So for that reason, controllers are supposed to advise you of any NOTAMs that are pertinent to your landing. So that certainly does not mean that ATC needs to tell you about every tower light in a 10-mile radius of your destination. I can't imagine how painful that would be if we had to do that. But it does mean that ATC is supposed to tell you about relevant NOTAMs to the airport that you're going into. But I very much would prefer to have things more in my favor, stack the deck in my favor, and use that resource that I have available in the airplane with a data link, NOTAMs and weather, and be able to look at it right in real time as I'm flying.
All right, Kevin, let's take a quick break. And when we come back, let's talk about that other side. Let's talk about you in the airplane.
Sounds good.
Earn all your pilot ratings and keep your flying skills sharp with Sporty's Pilot Training Plus. This all-inclusive membership unlocks Sporty's complete library of award-winning video courses so you can learn anywhere you have your phone, tablet, or laptop. For one annual fee, you get access to over $1,500 in courses, a smart investment in your flying career. Plus, enjoy free shipping every day of the year at sporties.com and apply for one of our 3 annual flight training scholarships. Learn more at sporties.com/pilot training. Now, back to Pilot's Discretion.
We are back with Kevin Plante, who is also a very active pilot in addition to his time behind the scope. Kevin, I'm interested in your approach to a flight given your day job. So let's say you're planning an IFR flight. What do you look at in terms of routing or weather or any flight planning topic that might not be obvious to a non-controller?
Probably not much of anything with weather. I think that's pretty cut and dried as far as what you look at as a pilot. When it comes to routings, all the different software providers, I believe, show historical routings so you know what has been assigned before. So like I personally use Flight Plan. I've had great luck using that tool with them. But I mean, as far as that goes, it's pretty standard flight planning stuff. I'm not sure that my ATC experience, well, maybe with busier airspace, I'll have less illusions about being able to get whatever I want going through busy airspace. I fly through New York approach airspace quite a bit. And as a controller issuing the routings, I know there's only about 3 ways to fly through their airspace. So as a pilot flying through, I don't have any expectations of anything else. And sometimes I get a shortcut from them and I'm pleasantly surprised.
Do you ever hear something as a pilot? Do you ever hear a controller say something or do something that you question or you say, oh, I wouldn't have done it that way? And do you just bite your tongue or do you ever push back?
You know, I got to apologize to my wife on that one because she flies with me quite a bit. So there's plenty of times when I'm flying along and I hear something a controller's doing and I'll curse about it or say, well, you're not paying attention. What's going on here? They didn't hear that. And so, yes, there's plenty of times where I'm hypercritical of ATC. How much of that actually gets transmitted with a push to talk button when I'm in the airplane? Well, that's a whole lot less of it.
And who has the most speed talking controllers? Is it New York or does someone else have controllers who are talking more words per second?
I think that's an individual thing, very much so an individual thing. I don't know how many times I've been in airspace that just isn't that busy. There's not much going on. And I think there are just some controllers that's just the way they like to do things is they talk super quickly. And it could be that's just the way they always do it. Or it could be they really think that they're busier than maybe they actually are. So having said that, I will train people if you're working like I say, a super busy final or a super busy approach sector, slow down a little bit. And the reason I advocate for controllers to slow down a bit when it's really busy is because the say again and the missed calls are something you really don't need to have happen when it's really busy.
Do you ever say blocked when you hear a transmission blocked, or you just wait for him to say it again?
I usually wait for him to say it again, unless I'm flying through airspace where I know the controller that's working and I'm trying to give him a hard time, then I might say that.
And how about weather? If you're en route, do you have any tips or tricks or something you do differently if you know there's some weather in your way? Do you approach a deviation or a reroute, or even just communicating with ATC that you approach that differently?
I think it depends on where the weather is that I'm trying to avoid. If the weather is over, say, a busy Class Bravo airport or in the vicinity of that, I'll probably try to figure out a way around it a lot farther out. So I'm not trying to do a whole bunch of deviations, and I'm not expecting to be able to just do whatever I want in super busy airspace. If it's quieter airspace, then, I just take it as it comes and do what I need to as I get closer to.
Now, I know you've got some time in a Cirrus, an airplane that can occasionally inspire strong opinions, but an airplane I fly and like a lot. I was struck when I first started flying that airplane that there's some things you can't really learn or understand about that airplane without flying it. There's the reputation, there's what you see from the outside. But what's something that you learned flying that airplane that you didn't really understand until you'd been in it?
Well, one of the things that I heard from people that probably don't know any better is that, it doesn't have much rudder authority. They didn't do a full spin certification and this, that, and the other about spin capability and rudder authority as a result. And I think that's a bunch of bull, because that airplane has plenty of rudder. You can land it and take off with a strong crosswind. Its manners are very well. The flying qualities, I think, are not very different than any other airplane in terms of just stick and rudder flying.
Yeah, I would say for me, it was the side stick. I was all worried about the side stick, having grown up flying Cessnas. And I noticed after, I think, literally 2 flights, I had forgotten about it. My hand fell there and you fly. So that was something that did not deserve any stress or worry whatsoever.
I agree with you like that on that one. It feels just like a yoke. It's just half the yoke and it's moved off to the side. That's all. But yeah, I agree with you. Very easy.
And I know you've done a little bit of flying, some charter work in jets. What's the biggest difference you see as a pilot flying the turbine equipment versus a piston like a Cirrus?
I think a lot of it applies to both. I think if you think about doing things, whether it's planning your top of descent or anything along those lines, if you think about things in terms of time, then I think a whole lot of that works a whole lot better. If you think about, okay, it's going to be a descent at 1,000 feet a minute, let's say, and how many minutes am I from destination or pattern altitude or crossing restriction or whatever it is, and you plan things in terms of time, it works out great. I think that works stepping up to turbine equipment, and I think that works well even if you're used to fly a 152 and you're moving up to a Cirrus. That same thought process translates very well.
That's a great tip. I know when I transitioned into a Cessna 210, the first real high-performance airplane I flew, everything just seemed like it happened faster. That airplane might as well have been a turboprop or a jet. And so you're 100% right that thinking about it in terms of how many minutes do I have to descend or start slowing down is a great way to approach a lot of those problems. And it transitions from every airplane. It's the same minutes thought process in a jet as a high-performance piston. All right, Kevin, at the end of Pilot's Discretion, we always do a lightning round called Ready to Copy. I'll ask some questions on a range of topics, and you read back your quick answer. Are you ready to copy?
Let's go.
I will try to talk slowly per your instructions. Describe your typical day as a controller in 5 words or less.
Wow, that's a tough one. Typical day as a controller in 5 words or less. I'm totally going against your lightning round concept here by being slow, but I would say shorthanded.
That's a good one. I'm not going to touch that. From a communication standpoint, what is one thing you wish pilots did better?
Speak clearly and directly.
And what's an example of that?
Trying to tie too closely to what might be in the pilot controller glossary. Say what you need to and get it out rather than stressing about exactly how you think maybe the textbook way it should be said is.
Should pilots read the 7110.65, the controller's Bible, or is that wasted effort?
If you have a hell of a time getting to sleep, then I think maybe, no, seriously, there are some interesting things in there that could be enlightening. So to take a flip through here and there, sure, why not?
Is it okay for me to ask a controller to read an approach chart in a pinch? Let's say I've diverted to an airport, I messed up and didn't pack my ForeFlight. Can you read me a plate?
Yes. But if you are asking that, I think you should be very specific about what information you want and what information is irrelevant.
Do controllers like it when pilots ask for special VFR, or is that just a pain?
It depends. If there's not other traffic that's going to be a conflict, it's really no big deal. Sometimes I'd rather you ask for special VFR and we get you on the ground or going on your way rather than doing a bunch of other things that maybe are sketchier and more dangerous.
If you could defeat the laws of physics and economics, what technology would make ATC's job easier?
An EFB next to me on the scope.
That actually sounds achievable.
I would think so, but here we are.
What's your favorite jet you've flown?
M2.
And why is that?
The avionics that are really great. The G3000 is fantastic. It's a comfortable cockpit. It's a natural flying airplane. It flies like a lot of other airplanes. It's just a pleasure to fly.
If I'm planning a scenic flight in the Northeast, your neck of the woods, what's the best place to go? Bar Harbor, Martha's Vineyard, White Mountains? Give us a place to go up that way.
Yes, all of the above. Probably between them, I think the Maine coastline is probably the best that way.
And what's your favorite airport up that way?
Brunswick is pretty good. I really like Brunswick because walking distance from where you park, there's a great brick oven pizza and brewery. So if you can bring a designated pilot with you, ideally, so you can have a couple of beers, that's the best situation.
Speaking of designated pilot, last time we were together, I realized you know an awful lot about bourbon. It's something folks in my neck of the woods have strong feelings about in Kentucky.
Sure.
So what is a relatively unknown bottle that is both good and reasonably affordable? Give us a recommendation.
Well, I think probably my favorite bang for the buck, inexpensive bourbon that's easy to get is Michter's. I'm a big fan of Michter's for that. If you want to stretch the budget just a little bit, Fable and Folly, I'm a big fan of. That one's probably not quite as well known. That comes from Orphan Barrel. So yeah, I really like Fable and Folly. That's like a 140 for a bottle type of a thing, 150, somewhere in there.
All right, I'm sure we'll have listeners chime in with their favorite bottle too. So
I hope so.
Leave a comment or send us an email. Kevin, our last question is always the same. You have one final flight. We want to know, what are you flying and where are you going?
One final flight before I hang it up for eternity?
Yep, that's right.
I think probably it would be some sort of a light twin, say an Aztec or something along those lines. And I think bouncing through the Caribbean would be a good way to wrap it up.
That sounds great. Kevin, thanks for being on the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to Pilot's Discretion, brought to you by Sporties, training and equipping pilots worldwide for over 60 years. For more episodes and today's show links, visit sporties.com/podcast. I'm John Zimmerman. We'll see you next time on Pilot's Discretion.